The Razee Saga. Part 17. Song of Defiance. The Razee 2 hadn't even settled into Sentinel orbit when the alarms began to howl. Rivers was still at the rail, watching repair crews drift across her scarred flank, when red strobes painted the viewport and klaxons rolled like thunder through the ship's spine. Multiple Veil signatures, came the report across fleet channels, voices hard with panic. Opening at the edge of Sentinel space, inside the outer halo net. No ceremony. No welcome. The homeworld system was under attack before Rivers' boots had touched the council floor. He barked for Gemini fleet to deploy, not with speeches but with vectors and jump arcs. The bastions lit their engines, Aegis vessels layered their shields, escorts unfurled into knife-edge formations. Isabella's shuttle had not yet detached, Hope was still in the council chamber, Stephen already shuddering with the pull of Sentinel's mark. The enemy had chosen its moment well. From the viewport, Rivers saw them tear open. Thin at first, like fractures in glass, the veils widened and deepened, their silence pouring into the void. Power readings collapsed in local relays, comm bands crackled and died. The inner halo net caught the first lance and flared bright, its rhythm wobbling under the strain. The void darkened, stars dimmed, the breath of silence pressing against the system's throat. Razee 2 forward. Pulse cannons online, Rivers ordered. The flagship lurched, shields snapping awake as crews slammed into position. Engineers routed energy into the retuned guns, Illyrian harmonics threaded through human conduits. The first volley ripped into the void, a pulse of resonance flashing across the nearest veil. It cracked, fracturing like shattered ice before collapsing into nothing. Cheers rose, cut short as two more opened wider than the first. Rivers gave the fleet-wide command. Every ship armed with pulse cannons unleashed fire. The system lit with overlapping bursts, beams hammering against silence. One veil folded, then another, but the rest bent, flexed, and widened again. The listeners were learning. He called for a coordinated jump, the maneuver rehearsed but never tested. One instant, hundreds of ships scattered across Sentinel space. The next, they vanished and reappeared in a single line, leaving a channel open between planet and net. From below, the Illyrians answered. Pulse cannons mounted into Sentinel's surface fired in unison, streaks of energy lancing upward. They struck the halo net and bounced, refracted outward, weaving into a lattice of rhythm. The effect was immediate. Veils shattered in sequence, silence ripped apart by the drumbeat of constant fire. The sky thundered with resonance, so loud that even in the command deck's crews felt it in their bones. The last veil buckled under the barrage, shuddered like glass under pressure, then broke apart in a final ripple of vanishing dark. The alarms faded. Sentinel was safe. For now. On the Razee 2's bridge, Rivers braced against the rail, watching the void clear. His ship trembled with strain, her scarred hull still blackened, her pulse conduits glowing red from overheat. She was battered, but she had stood, and the system had stood with her. The council chamber was chaos when he arrived. Dominion and Alliance envoys shouted over one another, half in awe, half in fear. The holomap still replayed the strike, veils collapsing under combined planetary and fleet pulses. Hope demanded calm, his voice carrying the weight of discipline. Isabella delivered the numbers with soldiers' precision. For Unity fleets ready, one nearly complete, the forges doubling pace. Stephen, pale but steady, told them what Sentinel itself had whispered. The veils were not only attacks. They were probes, threads of a net tightening around every star. Rivers cut through the noise. Defense before pride. Expansion before excess. Orbital canticle arrays around every major world. Pulse cannons woven into halo nets. Unity fleets stationed where the seams pressed hardest. Paradox would remain their shield, not their sword of conquest. The chamber grew quiet. Not unanimous, never unanimous, but enough. For now, the Alliance had chosen to sing back instead of cower. Outside the viewport, Sentinel's new nets pulsed a rhythm steady and sure. But Rivers knew what Stephen had said was true. The enemy was listening. And the louder they sang, the closer the abyss would lean. The war had not slowed. It had only shifted key. The council's arguments were still echoing when the next alarms cut them short. This time the holomap bloomed crimson not above Sentinel, but far away, where blue oceans and white clouds circled in their patient spin. Earth. The cradle of humankind, the root from which every Alliance banner had once grown, now lit with warning threads. Rivers didn't waste breath on speeches. He turned from the chamber table, voice like steel on stone. Cut the feeds. Council adjourned. No one followed him. Every envoy frozen in the realization that words would not shield the world they all owed their lives to. Minutes later, the Razee 2 thundered out of dock, her battered flank patched but still dark with scars. Engines flared. Escorts slid into formation and Gemini fleet carved their course toward Earth's system. On the way, Rivers opened channels to 2 Unity fleets already standing ready near the Shield planet. His orders were blunt, without ceremony. Join him at Earth. Form paradox if the veils pressed too close. When they emerged from fold space, the truth was already clawing at the halo net. 4 veils hung above Earth like torn banners, silence spilling from their rents into the void. The improved double-layer halo net glowed bright, holding for the moment, pulse cannons mounted in orbit firing steady bursts to fracture each opening. On the ground, planetary arrays thundered, their beams rising through the atmosphere in sheets of power that lanced into the upper ring. For a heartbeat, it looked as though Earth itself had become an instrument, hammering its rhythm into the void. But the listeners pressed harder. Their veils widened with unnatural speed, scaffolds reinforcing and bending under pulse fire instead of breaking. The first halo net layer shuddered and tore, collapsing in sparks. The second wobbled, its harmonics fraying, its rhythm faltering. Silence lances streaked downward, grazing orbital stations, blistering the flanks of defense satellites. The planet below trembled in shadows of silence, whole continents flickering with power surges. River set his jaw and pushed the Razee 2 forward. Pulse cannons full spread. The flagship trembled, her resonance batteries firing into the closest veil. It fractured but held, bent into a widening maw that pressed closer. The escorts layered fire, bastions thundering from the flank, Unity vessels arriving in arcs of light. 2 fleets locked, their hulls fusing in disciplined sequence, 12 by 12 joining until paradox forms shimmered at either side of Earth. Their massive cores lit with gathering charge. Paradox fired. Twin resonance cannons sang into the void, their harmonics weaving into the veil cluster. 3 collapsed instantly, torn into jagged shards that dissolved under the onslaught. But the 4th, the largest, twisted under the fire and held, widening even as it bled silence back at them. The planet groaned beneath it. The inner halo net wavered. Silence beams brushed the upper atmosphere, where they shredded calm towers and darkened cities along the equator. River's heart clenched at the sight of oceans flickering with shadows, continents smothered in waves of distortion. Earth had endured invasions, wars, extinction threats, but never silence itself. Again, Rivers ordered. The paradox fleets thundered another volley, their cores glowing near the point of overload. The veil shattered at last, splitting into fragments that burned away. The void cleared, the silence dissipating in stuttering waves, but the price had been too close. Both paradox hulls staggered in their formations, crews gasping, shields drained to threads. The inner halo net buckled but did not break, its emitters glowing red-hot against the strain. Earth was alive, but barely. On the Razee 2's bridge, silence settled like ash. Reports flooded in. Orbital stations crippled, defense satellites lost, hundreds of casualties across power grids and ground stations. Yet the world still spun. The halo net still hummed. The Unity fleet still held. It was victory by the narrowest margin. Rivers leaned over the tactical board, eyes following the data streams of the pulse cannons. The energy signatures told their own truth. Resonance alone was not enough. It had fractured the veils, yes, but too slowly. The listeners had adapted, reinforcing their scaffolds against rhythm alone. Something sharper was needed. Electricity. The thought landed clean, almost obvious. Pulse cannons worked by resonance, but resonance alone did not wound. What if it carried more than sound? What if, layered into every burst, was an electrical surge strong enough to burn what it touched? Not just veils, but the constructs and ships that sometimes emerged near them. Harmful, dangerous, but survivable, if coordinated. He turned to his engineers, voice clipped and hard. Begin new tests. Pulse cannons are to be refitted with electrical lattice. I want prototypes on the yards before the next seam opens. The Illyrians at the tactical table hesitated, then nodded, already sketching designs across hollow sheets. Layered coils. Power distribution relays. Harmonic stabilizers tuned to channel both resonance and shock. Dangerous, yes, but possible. Rivers leaned back against the rail, eyes still fixed on the scarred void above Earth. He imagined fleets firing not only with rhythm but with lightning, seams collapsing under sound and surge together. He imagined Paradox firing one pulse so loud and so bright it burned silence away entirely. The Council would resist. Too dangerous, too costly, too brutal. But Rivers knew what he had seen. Earth, his own homeworld, had nearly fallen even with every improvement they had made. The listeners were adapting faster than their defenses could evolve. To hold, they had to climb higher, strike harder, burn brighter. He gave the final order as the Razee 2 turned back towards Sentinel. The next Unity fleet in production, its hulls still half-born in the forges of the Shield planet, would be built with this upgrade from the start. Electric resonance woven into every cannon. Harmonic lightning to answer silence. If the listeners wanted to listen, then the galaxy would scream. The Shield planet never slept. Its skies were black with ash and shimmered with auroras cast by the forges. A world remade into an anvil where the galaxy's survival was hammered into shape. Isabella stood in the observation gallery as the first of the new Unity hulls glided into its trial cradle, still raw metal along the edges, cables hanging like veins. This test was unlike the others. Engineers had woven new lattice conduits through the cannon cores, heavy with coils and surge regulators. At their heart pulsed a marriage of resonance and lightning, a weapon meant to do more than fracture veils. It was designed to strike, to burn, to make silence bleed. Her hand rested lightly on the rail as the engineers began the countdown. The Unity vessel's pulse cannon angled toward the void, where a captured seam fragment, a fragment of the listener's silence preserved in containment, floated like a bubble of dead night. The cannon fired. Sound rippled first, the familiar thrum of resonance weaving into the seam structure. But a heartbeat later, light flared. White arcs of electricity snapped forward, carried on the resonance wave like riders in a storm. They struck the seam with a crack that rattled the gallery's glass. The fragment shuddered, bent, then collapsed, not in a ripple of harmless dissipation, but in a flash that lit the dock in searing brilliance. Isabella shielded her eyes, lowering her arm only when the glow faded. The seam fragment was gone. Not fractured, not drifted, but gone, erased clean. Around her, Illyrian scientists exchanged wide-eyed looks. Dominion engineers let out involuntary cheers, and the human shipwrights on the floor thumped their fists against the railings. She exhaled slowly. Proof. The test crews ran the numbers, checks racing across hollow boards. Resonance levels stable. Electrical feedback within tolerances. Hull integrity preserved. Not perfect. Power consumption spiked dangerously high and the regulators nearly tripped under the surge, but workable. The cannon had held. And in holding, it had shown them what the future could look like. Isabella gave the order without hesitation. Every Unity vessel in this new set would be fitted with electric resonance from the keel up. When they formed Paradox, its pulse would be more than a song. It would be a storm. She left the forge floor with the image still etched in her mind, already composing her report to Rivers. The Shield planet had built fire. It was up to him to carry it into the storm. On Sentinel, Rivers faced a chamber hotter than any forge. The Council had gathered, and the hollow played the trial again and again. Resonance layered with lightning, seams collapsing in light so bright the containment frame itself buckled. Voices clashed. Dominion counselors shouted warnings about collateral damage. If ships strayed too close, if formations misaligned, the lightning could arc into their own fleets. Illyrians called it reckless, an abuse of harmonics not meant for destruction. Even some Alliance envoys shifted uneasily, their eyes drawn to casualty projections if a misfire struck a populated orbit. Hope sat silent, weighing his presence more like stone than voice. Stephen leaned against the rail, pale from Sentinel's constant strain but listening with the quiet of one who already knew what Rivers would say. Rivers let the storm wash over him before he answered. His voice was steady, not raised, but it cut clean through the noise. They almost broke Earth. The chamber fell quiet, the echo of his words carrying further than any shout. He let it sit, then continued. Every improvement we've made, the double nets, the canticle platforms, the paradox fleets, they held but barely. Earth survived by a thread. If the listeners adapt faster than we can answer, that thread will snap. Electric resonance gives us something new, something sharper. The Dominion envoys bristled, muttering about danger. Rivers raised a hand. It is not uncontrolled. The surge can be tempered. Power can be measured, regulated. We decide how much to add, when to add it, where to fire. At low levels, it is no more dangerous than the pulse cannons you've already seen. At higher levels, it becomes decisive. And decisive is what will keep your people alive when the veils widen again. He gestured and the hollow adjusted, showing tiered fire levels. Minimal pulses for standard defense, stronger charges when seams multiplied, maximum resonance only when paradox itself locked into place. This is not recklessness, he said. It is readiness. Until we find a better way to defend ourselves, this is how we hold the line. And when a better way comes, we will already be alive to see it. The chamber murmured, but less harshly. Doubt remained, but doubt had been bent. The Illyrians leaned toward one another, whispering calculations. Dominion envoys looked toward Hope for guidance. Hope finally stood, his voice measured. You are afraid of the weapon. Good. You should be. But fear is not reason to ignore survival. I have seen the void when it wins. I would rather see it burned. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. Rivers stood at the viewport afterward, watching Sentinel's twin nets ripple their rhythm outward. Isabella's report flickered across his slate. The shield planet's forges now building with electric resonance as standard. The new fleet would rise ready to sing with storm. He closed the feed and let the silence of the chamber settle. The listeners would hear the difference in their next strike. When they pressed, they would no longer find only rhythm waiting. They would find thunder. Stephen did not sleep, not truly. Even when his eyes closed, Sentinel whispered in his blood, the mark threading through his veins like molten glass. Each night was a negotiation, how much he could endure before Stevebot carried the burden for him. But this night, rest fled altogether. He stood on the observatory deck, watching the great arcs of Sentinel's twin halo nets pulsing above the planet. Each beat reverberated through him like a drum he could not silence. And behind the rhythm he felt something else. Thin strands, weaving, tightening, threads not of defense but of invasion. The listeners were not attacking at random. He saw it now clearer than before. Their veils opened in sequences, not scatter. Each seam was a node, each node a point in a greater pattern. Like a net being pulled taut across the galaxy, each thread linked to another, forming not only weapons but a structure. A cage. He stumbled once, bracing himself against the rail, his breath catching as the pattern flared bright in his mind. The seams were not only doors. They were ears, listening posts feeding the abyss, learning the rhythms of their defenses. The more they fired, the more they sang, the more the abyss understood. When dawn reached Sentinel's horizon, Stephen was already in the council chamber, eyes hollow but burning with urgency. Rivers and Hope had been summoned, Isabella still away at the shield planet forges. He spoke without preamble, his voice low but taut. The listeners are not pressing blindly. They are weaving. The seams are strands of a greater net, probing, mapping, tightening. Every veil is part of a design, every silence a knot in the web. And unless we break that pattern, it will close. Hope's brow furrowed. You mean they're building something larger? Stephen shook his head. Larger is not the word. Total. When the net closes, it will not be one world under silence. It will be all of them. The chamber stilled. Even the Illyrian scientists who had been muttering equations a moment earlier fell silent, their hands frozen above their slates. Stephen pressed his palm to the hollow table, the mark flaring faint blue as Sentinel's pulse spilled across the display. The halo net projections shimmered above them, the twin arcs glowing steady. But then Stephen bent them with his will, reshaping their rhythm, layering a new pattern into the old. The scientists gasped as the model shifted. He had altered the nets not to reflect silence, but to invert it. Instead of bouncing resonance back in simple rhythm, the upgraded nets would weave counterharmonics across their arcs. Instead of simply breaking seams as they formed, they would scramble the scaffolds before they took shape. The net would not only block, it would blind, deafening the listeners' probes before they could map the void. Rivers leaned in, studying the pulsing arcs, the inversion weaving like a second skin around the nets. And you believe this will block them completely? Stephen nodded, though sweat beaded at his brow. Sentinel showed me. If the pattern is woven tightly enough, the seams cannot take hold. The listeners will press, but they will hear nothing but noise. It will not end the war, but it will silence their silence. Hope's eyes narrowed. Or overload the nets entirely. Stephen met his gaze with hollow calm. Then build them stronger. The Illyrians broke their silence, analyzing the design, voices layering into rising harmony. They admitted the logic was sound. Counterharmonics, inverted lattices phased into the nets. It was possible. Difficult, dangerous, but possible. They had never thought to fight silence with silence, to meet the listener's song with one of their own. Rivers straightened, his decision swift. Begin test. Apply the modification to Sentinel's nets first. Then roll it across the core worlds. If it fails, we rebuild. If it holds, we blind them. Objections rose. Dominion counselors warning of catastrophic failure. Alliance envoys muttering about the risk of destabilizing entire systems. Rivers silenced them with a single raised hand. They are building a cage around us. If we do nothing, it will close. If we fight back with old tools, they will adapt. Stephen has given us a way to make them deaf. We would be fools not to try. The vote never reached the floor. Rivers had already made the order. The Illyrians filed out in haste, their robes trailing sparks of holograms as they began recalibrating the net models. Engineers flooded from the chamber toward the shipyards, voices sharp with urgency. Stephen sagged against the rail, pale but resolute. Rivers caught his arm, steadying him. "You've bought us a chance," Rivers said, voice low. Stephen's eyes closed for a breath, his chest rising shallow. "For now. But the net is still out there. Sentinel can feel it. Every seam, every thread pulling tighter. We are racing a storm with no horizon." Rivers did not argue. He looked past the chamber's glass, where the halo nets glowed against the dark. Already their rhythm was being altered, tuned into something sharper, more dangerous. They would test soon. And when the next veil opened, it would not meet silence. It would meet a net woven by human hands, Dominion forges, Illyrian harmonics, and the visions of a man bound to a sentinel's song. The alarms began before Rivers reached the council chamber. Not Sentinel this time. Earth. The hollow map bloomed crimson as the alert streamed in. Multiple veils blooming inside Earth's orbit, silence pouring out faster than any recorded breach. The upgraded halo net was in place, but it buckled under the pressure like steel under a hammer. Pulse cannons fired, orbital batteries screamed, but without the new electric lattice, the beams broke apart against the expanding dark. Rivers didn't wait for the council to react. All fleets, Earth priority. He was already moving as he spoke, boots echoing on the deck toward the lift that would drop him to the Razee Saga command spine. Gemini fleet, jump on my mark. All warhammers into wedge formation. The comm crackled alive with Isabella's voice before he reached the bridge. She had been at the shield planet when the alert came. Her voice carried forge heat and cold urgency. Unity fleet isn't complete yet, but I have a plan. Meet me at Earth. What do you need? Rivers demanded. 3 warhammers on station. I'll bring Arclight myself. Rivers' reply came in iron cadence. Gemini fleet is moving. 150 ships. 10 warhammers. Skuda V at the head. Carriers refilled and wings primed. You'll have your hammer. He closed the channel and let himself exhale once. The Razee 2 shuddered as fold space enveloped her, the void peeling away to reveal Earth's skies already smeared with silence. The scene was worse than the reports. Veils hung over the planet like rent sails, silence lances cutting through orbital stations. The improved halo net glowed in layers, barely holding, its rhythm flickering under relentless assault. Ground arrays fired upward, their pulses bouncing between the arcs, but the seams bent, flexed, widened again. Earth trembled under a darkness thicker than before. Gemini fleet arrived like a wall of metal and light. Warhammers slid into wedge formation, carriers deploying fighters into the gaps, Aegis shields overlapping in a shimmering curtain. Skuda V led the charge, her new hull bright from refit, heavy pulse batteries already spooling. The fleet's rhythm took shape at once. This was not the fractured patchwork force from the Watcher War. This was a blade honed for defiance. But the enemy pressed harder. Veils expanded, silence beams clawing at the inner net. 2 orbital stations blinked out, their silhouettes swallowed in black ripples. On the ground, entire regions flickered with power loss as silence spilled down through the atmosphere. Rivers watched the halo net's harmonics stagger. One layer gone, the second faltering, the inner net about to rupture. If it broke, Earth would face the listeners naked. He opened a private channel to Shadow Dock, voice low. Release 1 shadow. No announcement. Silent deployment. Confirmed, came the reply. He switched to Sentinel command. Shadow Eye cloaked, full stealth, maintain orbit. No transmissions. We keep the fleet secret. In the void above Earth, a ripple of darkness parted. A single shadow emerged, her black hull absorbing starlight, her shields flaring as she moved between the listener's lance and the halo net. The beams struck her shields and broke, scattering across her armor like rain across rock. The Razee 2's bridge crews let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Then Isabella arrived. Arclight burst from fold space with her escort, her hull glowing white along its seams, the great cannon along her spine charged and ready. She swung into position beside Skuta V, the Warhammer's wedge forming around her like a crown. Rivers opened the channel. We're here. Her voice came back steady, forged steel and quiet fire. Then listen closely. Concentrate the Warhammer's pulse cannons. Synchronize their fire to Arclight's main. On my mark, you'll see something new. Rivers gave the order. 10 Warhammers shifted, their massive cores glowing as one, power building in pulses that rattled the hulls of nearby escorts. Arclight's spine hummed, her cannon drawing energy like a storm front drawing thunder. The veils pressed closer, silence beams striking at the inner net. The halo net shuddered, one node flaring out. Power grids on the planet's surface flickered. Now, Isabella's voice cut through. Warhammers fired as one, their pulse cannons merging into a single wave of resonance. At the same instant, Arclight's cannon roared, releasing not only sound but a white arc of electric charge braided into the pulse. The combined wave tore into the veils like a blade through silk. The effect was instant. The first veil collapsed outright, not fractured but annihilated, its edges burned into nothing. The second tried to widen but folded inward, its silence unraveling into sparks. The third and fourth shattered under the combined strike, their scaffolds breaking apart so completely that the void itself rang with the echo. For the first time, the veils did not drift closed to reopen elsewhere. They were simply gone. On the Razee 2's bridge, crews stared at the hollow, disbelief on their faces. Rivers felt it too, the difference was palpable. This wasn't a pulse breaking a door. This was destruction. The seams themselves had been erased. He opened the private channel to Isabella. It worked. Her reply came like a smile hidden under command. Electricity and resonance. It's not just collapse. It's erasure. They can't reopen what's been burned out. Below them, Earth's halo net steadied. Power grids flickered back online. Silence beams vanished from the sky. The void cleared, stars returning one by one like eyes opening. Rivers looked across the fleet status boards. Warhammers cooling from overheat. Arclight's core at critical levels but stable. Shadow holding position, her shields dimmed but intact. Gemini fleet intact, carriers still circling with their wings ready. The battle had lasted less than an hour, but its meaning would echo far longer. He closed the fleet-wide channel and gave his next orders, voice low but carrying. Log every parameter, every surge, every resonance harmonic. Feed it to Sentinel in the forges. I want prototypes of this integrated into every pulse cannon we own. New Unity fleets start with these upgrades from the keel. Engineers and scientists across systems would work without sleep to replicate what Arclight and the Warhammers had just done. Electric resonance would no longer be theory. It would be standard. On the viewport, Earth turned beneath the cleared void, blue and white and whole again. Rivers let the sight anchor him for a heartbeat, then turned back to his officers. This was only the first strike. The listeners would feel the wound, and they would answer. But for now, Earth had sung back, and the silence had broken. The Razee 2 slipped into Sentinel's orbit, trailing the scars of Earth's battle. Her hull still blackened down one flank, her shield emitters strained, her pulse batteries still bleeding heat into space. She looked tired but unbroken, like her commander. Rivers stepped from the bridge onto the central lift, his boots carrying him toward the medical bays where word had already reached him. Stephen had collapsed the moment the ship entered orbit. No battle this time. No silence beam to blame. Only the flood of Sentinel itself. When Rivers entered the med bay, the sight confirmed the reports. Stephen lay pale against the cot, his chest rising shallow, the mark across his frame glowing faintly blue. Monitors pulsed at his side, but no alarms screamed. The doctors had stabilized him. Still, his body trembled with residual shivers, his mind overloaded by visions Sentinel had forced upon him. Rivers stood a long moment, his presence casting shadow over the cot. He could feel the weight pressing down on his friend even now, information pouring faster than a human frame could bear. He turned to the lead physician, his tone low but unyielding. "Keep him under until he stabilizes. Rotate sedatives if you have to. Steve Bott will take his place until he wakes." The doctor nodded. "He'll need rest. Days, not hours." Sentinel nearly burned him out. Rivers' jaw tightened, but he gave a short nod. "Then he rests. No visions, no council meetings. Nothing until I say otherwise." He stepped aside as Marines escorted Steve Bott into the med bay. Polished frame gleaming, sensors bright, armored plating beneath his outer shell humming faintly. Rivers met its gaze, or Stephen's gaze through it, for a heartbeat. "Stand by," Rivers said. "You're needed." Steve Bott inclined its head once, then turned for the lift. The council chamber on Sentinel was alive with voices by the time Rivers arrived. Envoys from Alliance and Dominion worlds, engineers from Illyria, strategists from Cryon, each speaking over the other in a storm of exhilaration. For the first time they had seen seams not just collapse but vanish. For the first time, silence had not returned when the beams faded. The Warhammer's pulse cannons had proven their worth. Arclight had proven her design. Earth had been saved. The chamber's voices brimmed with awe. Rivers let them speak. He stood in silence, his hands resting against the table's edge, his gaze distant. The victory was real, but so was the cost. He had seen Stephen collapse under the weight of it. He knew the listeners would not let this stand unanswered. The doors opened. Steve Bott entered. The council fell quiet, half in recognition, half in unease. The machine moved with Stephen's posture, carried his voice when it spoke, but the faint metallic timbre gave it away as something other. Steve Bott paused in the chamber's center, tilting its head as though studying each representative in turn. Then, with perfect timing, its voice carried out, dry but unmistakably human in cadence. "You all look fragile. Has anyone tried resting, or is that just a human luxury these days?" A ripple of chuckles broke across the chamber. Rivers smirked despite himself, a brief crack in iron composure. A Cryon envoy barked something between a laugh and a cough, while the tartan delegate covered her grin behind folded hands. Even Hope allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch. The humor passed quickly, but the tension broke with it. Steve Bott's voice grew sharper, carrying authority. Stephen collapsed not from weakness but from weight. Sentinel fed him more than any one body should bear. The overload was staggering, and it carried truth with it. The chamber leaned in. Every delegate, every scientist, every commander waited. When the pulse cannons fired in resonance with Arclight, Steve Bott continued, the effect did more than collapse the seams. The energy didn't stop at the rift's edge. It carried through, into the abyss. The hollow table flared as the bot transmitted Stephen's memory feed. Projections shimmered, not exact but impressionistic, the way Sentinel had shown it to him. Waves of resonance traveling through collapsing veils. The first touch tearing silence apart. The second wave striking something vast beyond the rift. The projection quaked with phantom reverberations. Black scaffolds cracked. Choirs bent and faltered. The image shivered, then blurred into static. "We don't know the scale of the damage," Steve Bott said. But it was real. The listeners were hurt. Their song faltered. Their scaffolds cracked. The strike did not only erase the seams, it wounded what lay beyond them. The chamber erupted. Voices overlapping again, but this time not with awe, this time with hunger. The possibility of hurting the abyss itself stirred something fierce in every faction. Engineers whispered equations, Dominion envoys spoke of vengeance, Illyrians muttered about resonance balances. Rivers raised his hand. Silence fell slowly, grudging but steady. "We have proof of damage," he said. not proof of victory. Do not mistake the two. What we struck is vast. What we wounded is old. We've seen them adapt before. They will adapt again. Steve Bot stepped forward, its metal frame casting long shadows across the hollow table. Stephen will confirm the same when he wakes. But the truth is clear. We are not powerless. For the first time we can reach them. For the first time the abyss bled. The council stilled again. The weight of that last word pressed into the silence like a blade. Bled. The abyss was not invulnerable. The silence could be broken. Rivers let the moment settle, then gave his orders. Every forge, every dock, every design. Upgrade the pulse cannons with resonance electric integration. Integrate them into the halo nets. Arm every warhammer, every bastion, every carrier escort. And move forward on Unity fleets with these systems built from the keel. No di less. Hope's voice carried from the far side of the table, solemn but steady. Then the war has entered a new phase. No, Rivers said, his eyes hard as steel. The war has entered our phase. The chamber went silent again. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of the abyss, but the silence of decision. Every envoy, every counselor, every commander knew what had just shifted. The Alliance had found its defiance. And the listeners had felt it. The med bay lights were soft when Rivers and Hope entered, their boots falling quiet against the polished floor. Stephen lay against the propped cot, skin still pale but warmer than the ghost white they had carried him in with. His eyes opened as they stepped closer, faintly shadowed yet sharp with the fire of memory. The mark along his arm glowed faintly, its lines steady now instead of flaring out of control. Tubes fed hydration, monitors whispered their rhythm, but Stephen's voice was steady when he spoke. You've come for the rest of it. Rivers moved first, his frame casting a shadow over the cot. Hope lingered at the side, arms folded, his presence heavy as stone. Stephen's lips twitched faintly. Steve Bot already told the chamber what they needed to hear. The collapse. The strike. The damage. He paused, his breath catching before he forced it steady. But there was more. Sentinel showed me what lay beyond the rift. Not only silence. Not only scaffolds. Ships. Hope's brow furrowed, but Stephen's voice carried onward, low and certain. They have fleets. Whole armadas. Not carved from abyss stone or spun from resonance scaffolds. Ships like ours. But not ours. Stolen. Twisted. Remade. His eyes darkened with the memory. I saw hulls that bore banners I didn't recognize and others I did. Technologies from 100 worlds woven together. Engines that burned with cryon power. Weapons echoing Illyrian harmonics, frames built with tartan geometry. The listeners have not only silenced those they devoured, they've harvested them. Every world, every fleet, every piece of knowledge consumed into their own. The words pressed like iron into the chamber. Rivers' jaw tightened, his hand flexing at his side. They are not a chorus alone, Stephen whispered. They are an alliance of their own, bound not by trust but by silence. Every voice they've taken, every world they've broken, they've reshaped into their fleet. They are not only the abyss, they are the shadows of us all. Silence stretched in the med bay, thicker than the air recyclers could carry. Hope's voice was low when it came. You're saying every battle we fight, we may be fighting echoes of those who stood before. Stephen nodded once, slow. And every scene we fail to close feeds them more. Rivers stepped closer, his eyes burning like cold fire. Then we close them all. Stephen gave a faint smile, the barest crack of humor. Easy words, Admiral. Harder work. His eyes closed for a moment, his chest rising shallow. When he opened them again, they were softer, the fire tempered by weariness. But now you know. And now you'll fight knowing what waits. That matters more than anything. Rivers placed his hand against the rail, leaning closer. You've done enough. Rest now. Steve Bot will hold the weight until you're ready again. Stephen nodded, the motion barely a shift, then let his eyes close. Sleep claimed him in silence, steadier this time without the tremors of before. The Razee 2 hung in orbit of Sentinel, her scarred flank patched but still blackened, her cannons gleaming with newly forged modifications. Across her spine, resonance electric conduits had been laid in careful arcs, each one humming with restrained power. Engineers moved like ants across her plating, their welds sealing the final armor over the modifications. On the bridge, Rivers stood at the forward rail, Isabella at his side, Hope's voice carrying from the comm around them. The Gemini fleet hung in escort arcs, their hulls bright from refit, their weapons waiting to witness. This was the first test. Core charged, the weapons officer reported, her voice taut. Resonance coil aligned. Electric lattices stable. Rivers' gaze swept the hollow. Before them floated a target construct. Massive scaffolding assembled from Dominion plating and Illyrian harmonics. Its core designed to mimic a veil's resistance. Not a true seam, but close enough to bleed data. Fire control on my mark, Rivers said. Arc light loomed in the far distance, her cannon dark, her presence silent but steady. This time she would not fire. This time the Razee 2 would prove the new weapon. The officer's hand hovered over the console, power humming through the ship's spine. The air itself trembled with restrained charge. Mark. The Razee 2 roared. The cannon's pulse surged outward, a wave of resonance wrapped in a crackling arc of electricity. The sound shook through the hull like thunder trapped in steel. In the void, the beam tore across the space between ship and construct, striking the scaffolding with blinding force. The effect was immediate. The construct's harmonics shattered in less than a breath. Panels buckled, resonance cores collapsed, plating split like brittle glass. The scaffolding folded inward on itself, not just broken but erased in fire. The electric charge continued to ripple, carrying the resonance deeper, collapsing every node until nothing but sparks drifted in the void. On the bridge, silence reigned for a long heartbeat. Then the weapons officer's voice cracked through, awed and sharp. Target destroyed. Total collapse. No reformation detected. Rivers' hand tightened on the rail. His voice came low but steady. Log every frequency. Send results to the forges. This is the weapon now. Isabella's gaze lingered on the fading debris, her eyes sharp with recognition. This is what Stephen saw. Not just collapse. Destruction. Rivers nodded once. Then we'll give it to them. Every world. Every fleet. Every ship we have. In the silence of the bridge, the Razee 2's hull still hummed with the echo of her strike. She was scarred, battered, born from sacrifice, but now she carried something new in her spine. Not just defiance. A song sharp enough to damage the abyss itself. In the abyss, the silence trembled. The listeners had felt the wound of earth, the resonance electric strike tearing through their veils and bleeding into their scaffolds. Where once their song had been unbroken, now it wavered. Their chorus shifted from harmony into harsh dissonance. Ships stirred. Hulls of 1,000 worlds making rose from the black, twisted into the shape of obedience. Banners of long-dead civilizations gleamed faintly across armor now remade in the void's image. Engines lit with captured fire. Weapons built from stolen sciences aligned in grim unison. The listeners mobilized. Not in full, not yet, but with enough to test, to measure, to press against the damage that had been struck. On Sentinel, Steve Bot lit up red across its chassis, the glow spreading through its frame like a warning beacon. Marines reached for weapons on instinct before realizing the flare was not attack but message. The bot's voice carried through the chamber, louder than its frame had ever projected before. They're moving. The council stiffened. Rivers leaned forward. Where? Steve Bot's frame shifted, projectors sparking. A seam flared into view above the table, brighter and sharper than any before. Earth. Their answer comes now. Hope's jaw set hard. Rivers did not hesitate. Sound general call. Every fleet to arms. Gemini to Earth, full complement. Aegis to shield formation. We will not be caught unprepared. Earth's skies blazed with alarms as Gemini fleet poured from fold space. 150 ships strong, 10 warhammers at their heart, carriers belching wings of fighters into orbit. The Aegis fleet followed, 12 ships locking their shields together into a shell that encircled the world like a second skin. The halo net throbbed, its resonance steady for now, its counter-harmonics weaving the pattern Stephen had taught them. The new orbital guns pivoted toward the void, their conduits humming with pulse-electric fire. Rivers stood at the Razee 2's rail, his voice steady over fleet-wide calm. This is not destruction. This is study. Shields hold, nets hold, we capture what emerges. Learn before we burn. Gemini fleet will not fire to kill unless ordered. You just hold your shell. This is not their war yet. This is their probe. We will probe back. The seam opened. The void split in a jagged arc above Earth, silence pouring out in thick waves. From within, ships emerged, hulking silhouettes cut in the shapes of nightmares. One bore a hull etched in Illyrian glyphs, its once graceful frame now cracked and jagged. Resonance emitters turned to silence cannons. Another carried cryon engines belching black fire, its profile unmistakable even under abyssal markings. And one came forward pulsing with energy that felt wrong even to the void around it. An EMP ship. Its first strike lashed outward, a ripple of silence and static that washed over Earth's orbit. One of the orbital guns shuddered, its lights flickering before its core went dark, drifting powerless. "Destroy that one," Rivers said. His voice carried no hesitation, no room for misinterpretation. The warhammers fired. Skuta V led the volley, her pulse cannons hammering with resonance and light. The EMP ship crumbled under the combined strike, its frame shattering into shards of silence that drifted lifeless in the void. The others pressed forward. Silence beams raked across the Aegis shields, scattering like water across stone. The nets held, bouncing resonance in counterharmonics that kept the seams from widening. Fighters darted in and out, their weapons sparking against hulls too strong to fracture. Rivers' voice cut across the channel again. "Disable. Or take them alive." Gemini fleet moved as one. Ion disruptors lashed out, targeting engines. Grappling beams shot forward, seizing hulls and dragging them into position. Marines stood ready in boarding bays, their armor gleaming as they prepared to step into stolen shadows. One ship was forced into stasis, its engines severed, its weapons carved away by precision fire. A second followed, dragged under Aegis shields and pinned by resonance anchors. Marines poured into their hulls, their boots clanging against metal that was both alien and familiar, corridors twisted versions of technologies once their own. The fight was sharp but brief. The listeners had not come to overwhelm. They had come to measure. 2 ships captured, 1 destroyed, the rest retreating into the collapsing seam. The void folded shut with a hiss, silence retreating but not beaten. On the bridge of the Razee 2, Rivers watched the captured ships dragged into the net of escorts. Their hulls pulsed faintly, runes of a dozen worlds etched into plating. Some lights still flickered within, faint like dying stars. "Secure them," Rivers ordered. "Straight to Sentinel. Faraday cradle only. No signals in, none out." The council chamber thrummed with energy when Rivers returned. Hollow projections of the captured ships hovered in the air, their twisted designs sending shivers through the gathered delegates. Cryon envoys muttered curses at the engines they recognized. Illyrians whispered in horror at the perverted glyphs carved into hulls once graceful. Dominion voices spoke low of vengeance, of silence stolen and returned. Rivers stood at the center of the storm, his voice steady. "We captured 2. 1 destroyed. This was not an invasion. It was a probe. They wanted to measure us. They wanted to see how we would answer." Hope's voice rumbled from the far side of the chamber. "And what do you see?" Rivers' gaze swept the council, hard and unflinching. "I see that if they come with all of it at once, we will be crushed under their foot. That is the truth. Our nets will hold for a time. Our fleets will bleed. But against their full weight, as Stephen has seen, we are not yet enough." The words struck the chamber harder than any silence beam. The excitement dimmed, replaced by the sober edge of fear. The truth hung there, undeniable. "They have shown us what they can do," Rivers continued. "Now we study what we've taken. Every inch of these ships. Every core, every circuit, every stolen technology they've made their own. We'll learn how to break them before they can break us." Steve Bott stood at the edge of the chamber, its frame dim but steady. "The Abyss test. But tests cut both ways. Now we test them." The council murmured in agreement, subdued but resolute. For the first time, the listeners had stepped through not as whispers, not as beams but as ships. And for the first time, the Alliance had answered not only with fire but with capture. The war had shifted again. The captured ships hung in Sentinel's orbit like wounded beasts, bound inside the Faraday cradles. Their black hulls pulsed faintly, a sickly imitation of life, their silence smothered by the constant hum of containment fields. Marines guarded the docks with rifles ready, their orders clear. Nothing in, nothing out. Inside the laboratories, engineers swarmed. Illyrians in flowing robes bent over consoles. Dominion technicians stripped plating, and human officers prowled the decks, recording every detail. The work was slow, methodical, but with each panel removed and each circuit mapped, the Abyss surrendered its secrets. The first discovery came from the shields. The listener vessels bore defenses thicker than any seen, but at their core lay a lattice not unlike the Alliance's own nets. Woven resonance, tuned silence, layers built to repel both physical and energy strikes. The scientists spoke of impossibility, of the elegance twisted into brutality. But when they ran tests, piercing beams through samples of the lattice, they found cracks. One test weapon passed through clean. A shard of the past, a Watcher particle weapon taken from old battles and kept in storage. It sliced through the listener shield fragment as though it wasn't there at all. The engineers stared in silence, then repeated the test. Again the shield lattice folded, collapsed under the strike, unraveling like thread pulled free. Reports rushed upward. Rivers was called at once, summoned to the labs where the fragments still glowed faintly. The Illyrian lead spoke first, his voice careful, as though the words were too heavy to carry. Watcher weapons, particle rifles, particle cannons, they passed through their shields. Effortless. As though these defenses were never built to counter them. Rivers stared at the fragment. A scar cut across it, perfect and clean, the echo of the Watcher's forgotten fire. The Dominion engineer added, "Few weapons were recognizable, Admiral. But those that were, centuries old. Crude by today's standards. They had been collected, preserved, fitted to hulls remade for silence." Rivers' hand tightened on the rail. Centuries. If these ships were remnants, not newly forged but scavenged, that meant part of the Abyss was old, ancient even. And in age came weakness. He turned, his voice sharp. "Get me a count of every particle weapon left in our stores. I want one fitted to every warship capable of carrying it. From warhammers down to the smallest escorts. Reforge the rifles, reforge the cannons, build them new if you must. If this works, every ship in the Alliance will carry the Watcher's fire into the void." The engineers scattered, already calling for requisitions, already sketching mounts and conduits. The spark of possibility burned brighter than any council decree could have lit. For the first time since Earth's second siege, Rivers felt something he had not dared speak aloud. Hope. If the Abyss's ships were old, scavenged, cobbled together from centuries of stolen parts, then maybe, just maybe, their power was not infinite. Maybe it could be broken. Stephen awoke in the med bay that night with a jolt so violent it shattered the silence of the ward. His breath came ragged, his mark burned bright, and Steve Bot stirred in its corner, sensors flaring red as though reflecting his pain. Sentinel was screaming. Not in words, not in voices, but in pulses of energy, waves of meaning that tore through him like lightning. He clutched his head, gritting his teeth until blood streaked his lip, but he forced his voice out past the agony. "They're moving again." Nurses rushed to his side, monitors blaring, sedatives ready. He pushed them away, his eyes wild, his voice low and urgent. Not ships this time. Not probes. Something different. The mark flared again, and with it came visions. He saw the Abyss's fleets stirring, not in full strength but in patterns. Smaller vessels moving across the dark, spreading not to attack but to weave. Threads of silence stretched further, wider, drawn across the galaxy like lines of ink. Not veils this time. Not seams. Something else. A net tightening. A soundless map being drawn. His voice cracked as he forced the words out. "They're casting wider. Not to strike. To learn. They're charting us. Mapping the rhythm of every halo net, every pulse cannon, every fleet that moves." He collapsed back against the cot, sweat dripping down his brow. His chest heaved as the words slipped into silence, but the meaning lingered heavy in the med bay. Steve Bot's sensors dimmed, the glow fading from crimson to steady blue. Its voice carried across the room, flat but weighted. The listeners are listening back. On the Razee 2, Rivers listened to the report in silence, his hand resting against the forward rail as Earth's scarred halo net pulsed faintly on the hollow. Engineers confirmed the captured ships could be studied further, their weapons reverse-engineered, their shields exploited. Yet Stephen's visions made the victory taste bitter. Particle weapons gave them a new blade. But the Abyss would counter it. For every advantage they seized, the listeners shifted their rhythm, bending silence into something new. Rivers' voice came steady, his eyes never leaving the holographic nets across the galaxy. Then we adapt faster. Before their map is finished. The bridge was silent around him, crews watching as their commander stared into the void. The war was not only fire and steel anymore. It was becoming something deeper. A war of listening. Alarms split the quiet of Sentinel like a blade. Panels flared, sensors screamed, and the hollow map blossomed with fingerprints of incoming darkness. Veils opened in clusters above Earth, not single threads but snarls. Dozens of seams yanking at the halo net at once. The pattern was brutal and deliberate. Probe, pressure, punch. The listeners had chosen to strike where the ring of sound mattered most. Rivers did not wait for argument. He moved through the ship the way a current moves through wire. Focused, inevitable. On the bridge the crew snapped into the rhythm he set. Engines to stations, shields layered, carriers launching, comms sealed. He set Aegis into the shell around Earth and ordered Gemini into intercept arcs. The plan was simple in aim and complex in practice. Close the seams quickly and conceal the instrument that might end whole swarms. He had promised himself secrecy. The new particle weapon, W1, had to remain rumor until it could be used and hidden within the carnage of a single synchronized strike. If the listeners could see it, study its aftermath, they would adapt. If they saw only death falling like rain with no obvious cause, their learning would be slowed by confusion. The best weapon was one the enemy could not tell from the wind. The net shivered as beams of silence struck out like talons. Halo nodes flared and folded, counter-harmonics launched, and below them the planetary arrays answered in a steady roar. But the seams multiplied and braided, scaffolds knitting like bone. Aegis held where it could. Her 12 titans wove shields into a mantle, their outer fields bending the first lashes into harmless arcs. But a shield is neat at the edge and a mind can only listen so long. Rivers watched the pattern he had dreaded. The veils were not random. They were probing to find the new weakness. He placed the order that would have to be perfect. Close the seams first, he said, and do it in waves the Illyrians understood. Let Aegis be the shell if the nets failed. Hold the fire on W1. Keep the weapon cold, tucked in the spines of the ships chosen. Spare the knowledge of its existence like a secret kept under a hand. When the listeners brought their fleet in, let everything else be the screen. Let them swarm into the trap, and once their numbers were whole and unmasked, strike all at once. Leave 5 ships to be drawn away and captured, everything else to burn together so there would be no pattern for them to read. Gemini tightened. Scuda V took point with warhammers braced. Carriers loosed wings into cradling arcs, their fighters skimming the seam edges looking for anything that moved with purpose, anything that bore a makeshift signature of the Abyss scavenged tech. The Aegis shell held like a living cage, and Sentinel's upgraded nets hammered at the seams, each echo threaded to destabilize scaffolds where they coalesced. Ships poured out of the void, hulks marked by stolen glyphs, silhouettes that recalled worlds they had crushed. They arrived in clusters, formation as if rehearsed. The listeners were not merely probing. They had answered with a force meant to test limits. Aegis took the first blows, shields singing as silence lances struck, but their counter-harmonics held. The halo net protested and bent, but the outer and inner rings held the worst of the pressure away from the planet. Rivers let the first part of the plan run. Pulse cannons, canticles, planetary arrays, all hammered in coordinated bursts to keep the seams from widening faster than Aegis could stabilize them. Fighters skirmished with boarding tendrils and small craft. The listeners pressed, but Rivers watched them commit, watched their field thicken into a shape he could measure. When the enemy mass had formed, when the net of their fleet was dense and the oddities of their hull signatures lit the tactical boards in countable lines, Rivers triggered the second phase. He authorized a single encrypted relay across the chosen carriers, a cold channel that reached only the captains selected to carry W1. Their faces in the feed were grave, every hand steady. They had been drilled. This execution demanded perfect timing. More than that, it demanded silence afterwards. W1S remained cold, hidden within 12 of Gemini's warhammers and grafted onto the Razee 2 and 2 bastions. The rest of the fleet carried conventional resonance electric upgrades, powerful in their own right, meant to fracture and hold. But these would be the diversions. The particle weapon's true effect would be revealed in the chorus. On River's mark, all pulse cannons fired a final, concentrated sequence to pin the enemy fleet where it sat. Canticles from orbit added pressure. The halo net bounced engineered harmonics at their edges. Aegis tightened its shell, magnetic lines knitting, shields glowing like a heartbeat. The listeners howled in the absence of sound. Their formations shuddered, but they did not flee. They had come to taste the Alliance's response. Then the W1S sang. Every weapon that carried the Watcher's particle line discharged at once. The release was surgical in its timing and brutal in its effect. Particle beams did not just cut resonance. They passed through the enemy lattice and detonated where their scaffolds still tried to hold. Hulls that had looked solid and whole flared as if lit from within. Black plating peeled away in bright petals of reaction. Drives flamed and collapsed like dying suns. Resonance nodes that had been used to stitch silence into place shattered, their scaffolds unraveling into noise. The plan was cruel and clean. Because the W1 shots were simultaneous across the whole mass, there was no single origin for the listeners to study. The destruction rained across their fleet in a patternless wave. One by one, they died without time to call a lesson into being. Where the particle waves met their targets, they burned deeper than resonance alone, severing the scaffolds that allowed reformation. The seams these ships had been probing were not only collapsed, the very frameworks that supported them were destroyed. Rivers watched the tactical feed as the bulk of the enemy fleet folded into sparks. It was magnificent and terrible, and he felt the weight of it like a hand pressed to his chest. Around the periphery, as planned, a handful of ships had been allowed to slip the trap. 5 in total, drawn out by carefully staged fighter harassment and evading maneuver Rivers had authorized. They fled with their signatures trailing and sloppy, and 2 of them, predictable in their scorched and ancient technology, isolated themselves long enough for Aegis and boarding parties to close fast and take them. 1 ship required destruction. The listeners had placed an EMP platform among their number, and in the first cold flash it lanced out and killed an orbital gun platform, sending it dead and drifting before the fleet's collapse finished it. Rivers had counted that possibility and accepted the cost. 1 station down was preferable to letting the enemy carry knowledge back from a near escape. When the flare died, the void was littered with the husks of what had been a probing fleet. The seam it had poured from collapsed and sealed in the wake of the particle onslaught. No pattern remained to explain what had happened. There were wrecks and silent icons, and 3 captured hulls pulled limp into nets. 2 taken whole, 1 derelict and scorched, its systems butchered and dead. Aegis set its shell back into station around Earth. The halo nets rang in aftershocks and then settled, humming the thin lullaby of post-battle stabilization. On the bridge of the Razee 2, Rivers let out the breath he had not known he held. He did not exult. He catalogued. He ordered salvage vectors, containment teams, sensor sweeps. He sent immediate encrypted instructions to the Shield Planet and Sentinel laboratories. Analyze everything, keep W1 cataloged and hidden, and do not, under any circumstance, speak of its use beyond these walls. Back at Sentinel, the council met in a room that smelled faintly of burned alloy and recycled urgency. Engineers projected the kill maps. There was euphoria, but it sat beside a sober fear. The listeners had been hurt, yes, but they had also learned to commit force in ways that could crush a world if they brought it all down at once. The counselors argued the calculus out loud. The bait had worked. The capture had yielded priceless material. But if the Abyss chose to attack with everything it had, would any net, any fleet be enough? Rivers listened. He accepted their fear as sensible. He also carried the evidence of the day in his pocket. The 3 ships, the captured cores, the data feeds that showed what the particle weapons did. Hope spoke of restraint in display. Stephen's quiet warning about the listener's mapping echoed in every mind. The conclusion was bleak and practical. Do not let them know what killed their fleet. Keep W1 secret, build the weapons, arm the Unity fleets, but never expose the pattern. If they suspected the Watcher's ghost had returned to the living, they would learn to shield themselves faster than any forge could mend. they agreed not in blind harmony, but with the hard, careful consent of leaders who had seen how near the edge had been. The Alliance would have a terrible hidden blade. It would be wrapped, buried, and ready. The listeners had been struck. The war had turned another counting stone. Outside, the halo net hummed and the Faraday cradles held their prisoners in the dark. Rivers looked at the hollow again, at the shape of the sky over Earth, at the small symbols marking the captured hulls. He knew the next strike might be greater, fiercer, smarter. For now, though, the Alliance had a weapon that could break the abyss scaffold. For now, the galaxy had a secret that might make all the difference. Subscribe to follow along with Buck Rivers and the Gemini Fleet.